Tots Maywe, welcome back to another episode of Gaia Gossip, a wonderful production hosted by her Many Voices Foundation. I'm your host, Mary Jane Oatman, and I'm super thrilled to be able to have a guest join us today to talk about food, healing, and the work that he does across Turtle Island and beyond, and really doesn't need a whole lot of big introduction. Been across Indian country making a big splash. Oglala Lakota Sioux chef, author, and Indigenous food activist Sean Sherman has been revitalizing traditional food systems and Indigenous cuisine, not only in Minnesota, but across the world. So again, an honor, a privilege, and certainly in for a big treat. Thank you again, Sean, for joining us on Gaia Gossip.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So let's just jump right in because I know that there's a lot of excitement about the work that you're doing as you expand, you grow out your facilities, publish another book, and get that into the universe. I know a lot of your work has been deeply rooted in reclaiming Indigenous food systems. So, I guess to kick it off, what first awakened you to the healing power of ancestral foods?
Well, I mean, I've been a chef for most of my life. I feel like I've been working in kitchens at least for most of my life, starting at the age of 13, and just always had a love for food. Ever since I was born, I've loved food. So I became a chef in Minneapolis in my 20s and 30s, and really kind of just focused on building a chef career. And it was a few years into that chef career that I just realized the complete absence of anything that was Indigenous, because there were no native restaurants out there. There weren't really any cookbooks out there that I could really learn from, I felt like at the time. And so it shot me on a path to try and understand as much as I could about my own heritage when it came to foods. And so I just did a lot of reflection and a lot of just kind of thinking about, my heritage, which was Lakota, and like what were my ancestors eating, and what were their knowledge of plants, and from a culinary perspective, what did we use for things like fats and sugars and salts, and what kind of plants did we use, what kind of animals were we utilizing, what kind of cooking techniques did we use, what kind of food preservation techniques. And it just put me on a path to try to understand as much as I could, which is now a lifelong journey of just really understanding Indigenous foods in general. And so that turned into a business that I started in 2014 under the Sioux Chef name, which was just a play on words because it's SIOUX. And we've built a lot over the past, I don't know, it's been since 2014, so it's been a while. And, we're in a big growth spurt right now, launching another major restaurant. We have a second restaurant concept in the works for the fall. We're getting ready to expand our whole mission and move our nonprofit into Montana region and start building the model we built in Minnesota. And we just growing, and we're up for another James Beard nomination, which we'll see in early June if that happens.
Congratulations. It was such a pleasure to be able to visit Owamni in person and then also the Indigenous Food Lab. There's something really special going on at that food lab with the multi-generational education instruction work that's being accomplished there. What do you see that place doing in its form and transformation in Montana? Is it going to be very similar hub of knowledge incubator space around Indigenous foods?
Yeah, so the model that we've built in Minnesota, we have a space where we do a lot of food production, and we do a lot of product development, and we do a lot of distribution because we have an online store, and we move both retail and wholesale Indigenous food products all over the place. And we use the restaurant as a place that creates a lot of work, a lot of jobs, because we've been able to keep a pace of about 100 employees on staff at Owamni. And as we're getting ready to transfer Owamni into a larger restaurant, we're basically tripling the size of our original restaurant space, which is probably going to double our staff size. And so I'm looking at probably having a little over 200 employees by the end of June, basically across the board. And we also have our educational team, which just puts out a ton of Indigenous focused education and just trying to revitalize and just put a lot of effort into Indigenous thoughts and philosophy and education in general. So we have 230 plus videos on our YouTube channel panel from Indigenous Food Lab right now today, which is a pretty large body of work. And we're also launching what's called Meals for Native Institutions this month, which is a large commissary kitchen we have in Minneapolis. And the purpose is to make large format foods specifically for schools and hospitals, because we know restaurants will never be a place for food access or food relief, because it's a privilege to go to a restaurant. You need money to be able to do that. But we want to be able to get some of these healthy native recipes directly into school systems, especially for the younger kids, and hopefully hospitals, and hopefully other things like community centers, anybody who's feeding a large group of people. And so those recipes are just things that people can heat and serve, and just options outside of your typical like Cisco and US food type foods that you see kind of all over the place. And so that's kind of the main model, is that food product development, distribution, Meals for Native Institutions, the restaurants, and we're just getting ready to expand that. And so Montana will be our first expansion in Bozeman, and we'll start working on those components throughout the rest of this year. So we do have we're getting ready to hire our first regional director in that region, and just to try to mimic what we've built, because everything we've built was built to replicate. And we also have a toe dipped into Anchorage, Alaska. So after we get Montana going, we'll start to pivot and look how we build out there too. But our goal is to put regional center points kind of all over the country eventually, to help develop more indigenous food operations, spread more indigenous foods around, create more fun spaces for people to gather, like restaurant spaces, and we'll just see what happens.
I love it. The concept of like vertical food systems in Indian country, where we actually, start looking at the sourcing of where our foods come from to the end. And I think that a lot of people in this country are just really unfamiliar with what indigenous foods are here, because you just, run to Walmart or you go to the restaurant and you get food. So what are some of those indigenous ingredients that you guys are integrating into these modern kitchens and menus?
Well, we look at all of North America, and we look at even Mexico through Alaska as far as the space that we look for indigenous products, because we have a lot of connections throughout Mexico and Canada as well as the United States. And so we just try to showcase all of this amazing regional diversity, and that's something that the new cookbook called Turtle Island kind of explores, is looking at the massive diversity of indigenous peoples across North America, erasing colonial borders, and just looking at this tapestry of amazing, just diversity. And so as we're creating recipes, we're trying to make recipes make sense to which regions we're working in. So if we're working in Minnesota here, we're using a lot of the Great Lakes and even some of the Great Plains foods. And so we have a lot of bison and wild rice and maple and fresh forest berries and forest herbs. Like we use things like pine and cedar and balsam firs and high bush cranberries and just wild gingers and things that grow in the forest, But on the plains, it's a little bit different. And, as we're moving in different regions, like Pacific Northwest is completely different. The Northeast is different. The Southwest is different. Parts of California are even diverse, So we're just looking at how do we get regionally and culturally appropriate foods out there to people and start to build recipes that make sense for the regions and the spaces. So it's a big challenge, but we've been doing it for quite a while, and we've created hundreds of recipes, and the restaurants are a fun space to explore and to try out new things, and to see what people think. But when we're doing some of these institutional foods, we're making very specific offerings and recipes for very specific regions. And so that's the hopes, is to just wake people up about this and searching for indigenous producers from all these various regions, because our model is purchasing regional indigenous first, no matter which piece we're working on, and then national. So, we're bringing in tons of wild rice from different tribes across Minnesota and even parts of Canada. We're bringing tons of corn products in from all over the place, from many different nations. And we have native beans and native chilies and native sunflowers, supporting native agriculture. So working with different native farmers around us. And so there's just a lot that we can do. And so it's just an exciting world for indigenous foods. And, we're just literally reframing what American foods are by bringing in this indigenous perspective.
That's what I love, is really finding a way to build those economies for the indigenous communities. I am a huge fan of the White Earth wild rice. I was very blessed to get a couple of bags delivered to my house yesterday. And when I was doing some work with the White Earth community, I learned that they pay their community members to hand harvest their wild rice. And they set aside a budget of $1 million to pay their tribal members to harvest that wild rice, which then goes into an economy, a for-profit economy for their wild rice industry, creating sustainable jobs, hyper-local jobs, from their sustainable food economies is really exciting to see. So shout out to White Earth and all of the work that they're doing up there. Because I know that the identity and sovereignty of food systems has really, shifted across the landscape. What role do you see that seeds play in that cultural identity and the preservation of sovereignty?
It's just part of our legacy as Indigenous peoples because we have such a vast area of what was traditional agricultural spaces of where corn culture kind of spread throughout, because corn culture begins from the bottom of Mexico in those regions and it kind of shoots both north and south into the Americas. And so moving into North America, like it travels through most of Mexico, most of the Caribbean, and all the way up the eastern seaboard, all the way up the Mississippi and Missouri River valleys, and even almost to the Rocky Mountains in most spaces. And so there's just a vast region where traditionally agriculture was at, but obviously today we have indigenous farms all over the place, including up in Alaska and, basically throughout Canada and all over the place. So understanding the true stories and meanings behind a lot of these heirloom seeds is a really important piece for us. And that was something that I started researching really early on in my career as to who were indigenous seed keepers out there and across Turtle Island, who was holding onto these seeds, what were the stories behind them, what were the names of some of these amazing heirloom varietals, and how can we keep promoting and helping people to continue the legacy of those seeds out there, because it's a lot of work to farm and to keep seeds alive, and I've seen so many museum spaces where they collected so many seeds over the past century and a half, and a lot of those seeds just sat in shoe boxes in basements and end up dying, and you can't germinate them again after a certain amount of time. And so we need to be a lot more careful with our heirloom varieties of seeds, because we have no idea how many heirloom seeds were wiped off the face of the earth during the colonial period, especially across the 1800s, when the United States was extremely aggressive against the indigenous communities, as it was just taking massive land spaces all over. And so we just really want to promote and help a lot of those people continue to have that legacy of growing those amazing seed varietals. And there's just so much out there, and we try to utilize them the best we can, but we also really put a lot of respect, because we want to make sure that, people aren't culturally appropriating these seeds and, trying to make money off of these seeds, because some of them are very special, and we want to keep them in the hands of indigenous peoples and away from big GMO companies that are trying to take those seeds and trademark them for their own. So there's a lot of battle when it comes to seeds out there.
Absolutely. I know we have a very sacred plant for our people that blossoms the huckleberries. And a lot of people have tried to commercialize the huckleberry because there's been a lot of commercial harvesting going on in our usual and accustomed territories. And from, the word on the street is that she does not want to be grown in a greenhouse, aquaponic, hydroponically, like no other way, that you got to go into the soil, grows in specific climates. And so I see a lot of interesting things happening in the food labs, if you will, regarding indigenous systems. So how can modern food systems shift, from that extraction, I guess, if you will, that just really extractive commodity, commercial framework into more of a, I guess you could say, reciprocity with nature in this modern economy?
Yeah, well, it really starts with ourselves, because we have to be really intentional about who we're spending money on when it comes to food, And so if we are able to adjust our diets and to really bring in a lot of indigenous food, just from indigenous producers, particularly, because I could go to Walmart and buy enough food to make an example of indigenous foods, but the Waltmans don't need my money. I would rather be giving my food dollars to, and specifically searching out indigenous providers out there. And so that's going to take some time, because sometimes it's hard to find access to those indigenous products, which is why we created an online store, so people can order and have things shipped. But ideally, we need more spaces where people can find indigenous food products more locally and regionally. And just educating people more about those particular farmers and producers around us and what we can do with them. And that's why we're also just creating tons of recipes out there in basically all regions to help people get ideas of what they can do, because, we're not doing traditional recipes necessarily. Like, there are some traditional pieces here and there that are mixed in, but largely we're futurists. Like, we're creating new recipes. We're helping to evolve the food system into something new and something for the future, for the next generations, because we don't have to be confined with time. Like, we can move past where we are, and we can celebrate the past, but we can also create a new future that is extremely inclusive of Indigenous food products and all of the health that will come with that.
Well, speaking of recipes, Sean, can you share with us a dish that you have developed that kind of tells that powerful story of resistance and healing through food? Do you have that one dish? Because I can think of several from having eaten at Owamni.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to pick a dish just because we've created, who knows, probably thousands of recipes over the past, since 2014 when I started the Sioux Chef. And there's so much, but, we try to make food taste like where we might be. So in Minnesota, like, we might have something with wild rice and walleye and blueberries and rose hips and balsam fir and things that you can literally just like look around your environment and see all of them without even moving, and just like everything is right there around you. And so as we explore different regions, it's that kind of same thing, because we're using a little bit of wild foods, a little bit of heirloom agricultural foods, some wild game or birds or fish or seafood or whatever the protein choice might be. And, largely at Owamni, we were so plant forward that probably over 60% of the menu was plant-based anyways, so it was easy to have a plant-based diet with what we're doing. And because of the philosophy I've been using since I've started the Sioux Chef of just removing, ingredients that European and immigrants had brought over. So taking away things like wheat flour and cane sugar and dairy products and beef and pork and chicken, and just focusing on what was indigenous here first and what makes sense culturally and regionally. And how do we apply that to the modern day today? And just, again, like thinking of new recipes, because like we don't have to always do the same ones over and over. Those have places as traditional foods, but we can also create a new future for all of our indigenous foods. So it's just an exciting time because like there's no rules really. We can just create, and there's so much that we can do.
I would go back every day for that big braised bison. Oh, so delicious. So, what does Indigenous mentorship look like? I mean, I've seen you in action doing live virtual cook ins with other Indigenous chefs from across the country. One specifically here on the Nez Perce Reservation, you did a collaboration with Chef Tamina, and you guys cooked some fish. You did some amazing traditional recipes. Is that a component of the expansion work that you're looking at? Is, what does that look like to interface with other Indigenous chefs? Because I mean, whether you like it or not, you are a mentor, and definitely a lot of innovation and inspiration has come from the work that you do across Turtle Island.
Well, I mean, we've just always been very open with working with people basically everywhere and just having open doors, because we're just trying to be a support center to help out. And because, I've had to create all of this organization from nothing. I started with I think when I started as sous chef, I had like $3,000 saved up as a life savings, and my credit score was probably like 420, and it was not good. It was a huge uphill climb to be able to build all of this. And so I feel like as we've opened up doors, not only for ourselves, we're opening up doors for other people of how we can go through this. And I talk with a lot of native chefs all over the country quite a bit, just to be able to give advice or, just have conversations about where we're going with things and just staying connected. And I think that connection is a really important piece, because it's hard for people to ask for help sometimes. And it's hard for people to, people just sometimes ego can get in the way with things. And, I've tried to keep the ego out of this completely. And from the outside, it might look like this celebrity chef persona that's being created. But the reality is this work isn't about myself personally. This work is really about opening doors and trying to make a better future for the next generations. And that's the goal that just keeps everything moving and growing, is like, how do we continue to grow a foundation of Indigenous support out there for our foods and for our health that can last for generations and not just be dependent on one particular person, but it's going to take all of us to be able to pull this off together.
Yes, I've seen a huge uptick of Indigenous chefs on mainstream network television shows, including some word on the street about an upcoming guest on the program Chopped. So, can you tell us a little bit more about that whole experience?
Yeah, that was fun. We've been able to be on some of those big mainstreams. We did a Top Chef where we gave them an Indigenous food challenge in Wisconsin, and then we just had this Chopped episode that was pretty much almost all Native except for Chef Eric, who is another judge. He does food from Ghana. He just has a beautiful cookbook that's out right now. But we were able to have four Native chefs and myself and Chef Piet as the judges on that show. So it was just a really cool thing. And Chop's kind of a funny one just because they give you weird ingredients and not necessarily everything is indigenous, But it was a really cool episode to see that many Native people on something so mainstream. I think is just really great. And it's hard to be a judge for that because, everybody there were colleagues and friends of mine, but everybody also knows what they're getting into, and when we're playing with those kinds of competitions, it really comes down to how well are they completing this challenge of using these crazy foods that they get presented to try to figure out a dish in almost no time, So it's a big challenge, but it's fun to watch, and that's why people enjoy those kinds of shows. But yeah, it's very special to have something so indigenous on such a big platform like Chopped.
Yeah. Is there any food that is out there that is like on our Indigenous landscape that has been a difficult or challenging one for you because one, you either you can't find a taste palette for it, or another situation that I've seen is a lot of people, I come from the Pacific Northwest where we are salmon people. And I have a lot of people that have openly said they don't really eat a lot of fish because they don't know how to handle fish. They don't know how to cook it. They don't know how to cut it up. They just feel not very competent or confident in filleting a salmon. So, is there any fish or game species that's out there that has been a challenge to you that you have kind of struggled with?
Bear, I mean, they're really hard to catch. They're mean. I'm just teasing. I think it's, there's some foods are very scarce. Some of our traditional foods can be hard to find, and sometimes we lose a lot of information about them too. And so sometimes some foods can, when we have them, we treat them very special. And there's so many tribes out there, and there's different rules of things, because growing up on Pine Ridge, we're so landlocked. We didn't have a lot of fish growing up, and we were obviously stuck on commodity food program foods too. So rarely did we have some of that fresh stuff. And so a lot of people grow up not knowing anything about fish, particularly in spaces like that, and I've met other tribes that, don't eat bison for particular rules in their own societies and communities, as an example too. So like, we're not all the same, like we have many different tastes and many different traditional foods. And I think it's important for us to understand that, but still appreciate that, we don't have to, because, we can celebrate our traditions and we can continue to hold on to some of those pieces. But again, the more indigenous foods that are out there, the better for us, and the more plant diversity that we put into our diets, and understanding, putting a lot more education, especially towards our youth, of our vast knowledge as indigenous peoples of the kinds of plants that are around us and what they can do for us in our lives. Because plants give us everything, it's food and medicine and crafting, and there's stories and all sorts of stuff that we connect with plants that can bring many different things into us. And so it's just important for us to explore that. And again, like, it's a challenge of like, how do we get our indigenous foods out there? How can we get our youth having access to indigenous food? So it's not just, USDA certified pizza for school lunches, but actually having real indigenous foods that's culturally relevant to our particular regions, and making sure that people have access to that. And again, like, exploring new recipes, so we don't always have to do the same thing, that we can create new things out of these indigenous products and have fun with them, because like this year we're opening up a secondary restaurant called Shota, which is an indigenous barbecue concept, and that's going to be a lot of fun to play with, because we're going to do a basic barbecue restaurant, but we're going to do it in our style of just indigenous only, with indigenous proteins and indigenous sides. And it's still going to look like a barbecue restaurant, but it's just going to be a little bit different. And there's going to be a lot of health baked into that too.
Ooh, I love that. We've been playing around with a very similar concept inspired by what your work has done, because our food systems, the Nez Perce, one of the largest hatchery producers of Pacific Northwest salmon, but we don't have the processing facilities. So realizing that we got a lot of food waste for a lack of processing facilities. What are some of those, as I talked earlier about like a vertical food system in Indian country, what are some of the challenges that you've seen out there across Turtle Island with that specifically, with some of the waste in processing around traditional food systems?
I mean, I think it's going to be a challenge that we all kind of take on too, is how can we be more resourceful, which is a huge value from our ancestors, because we didn't have the privilege to be wasteful, in the traditional days, because we were taught what to do with everything, of how to process everything and how to utilize all the byproducts for something, because we had countless generations of that knowledge of what to do with all the byproducts, whether we're breaking down animals or seafood or fish or even plants, so we figured out just what to do, and we just didn't create trash like we do today, which is so normal, and we just buy things and throw them away and create trash every day. That's normal in our lifetime right now. So as we're working on some of these things, I think we have to challenge ourselves of how can we be more resourceful, how can we be less wasteful, and that's a challenge we're working on right now with our own restaurant, because restaurants can create a lot of food waste and pieces like that. But we're trying to look at what can we do with some of these leftover food scraps that we're like processing, like stems from chilies or whatever it might be, and figuring out ways to make cool things out of them, like fermenting some of these byproducts and making cool sauces out of them, or just dehydrating things and making powders out of them. And there's all sorts of solutions. It's going to take some time and effort, but it's just a challenge that we're kind of picking away at. It's just finding ways to be more creative with processing.
Yeah. Well, despite the challenges, I guess shift that to what are some of the systems or practices that are giving you the most hope right now, and what you're seeing in the reclamation of Indigenous food systems?
We're just seeing a lot more attention, because indigenous foods are breaking into the mainstream, and I think that's really important because we want to start to normalize that. And we still have a large upwards battle, because right now we still have politics trying to strip away indigenous histories and mentions of indigenous peoples, and a lot of our rights are, up just up in the air, and when it comes down to it, and the way people are moving, trying to make it harder for indigenous peoples to vote, for example, all of these things are kind of happening right now. So we have to be very careful, and we have to be very open and vocal about protecting our rights, protecting our land spaces, because we have this massive battle in Minnesota with the boundary waters that is being opened up for mining, which is just the wrong direction, because we need to be protecting our natural resources and protecting things like these natural wild rice streams and waters that kind of flow into that, and not just polluting everything with what we know a mining company is going to do to those natural resources. And so we have to really stand up and have unified voices, and just be really aware of a lot of these attacks that are happening on our sovereign rights and the future of our indigenous food systems, And so it's really important that we're very aware of all of those pieces, and what can we do right now to have a larger voices together, and to really support other regions and other tribes as they're going through some of these really big challenges.
Yes, a lot of challenges ahead for sure. I know that this time that we're in has created a lot of opportunity for tribes to kind of just reassess doing things differently. My my tribe here in the Pacific Northwest has 500,000 acres of agricultural lands that have historically been leased and farmed and exported out. And there's been an evolution, a shift of what do we do with those 500,000 acres to build our economies. So I see a lot of inspiration, a lot of creativity that has been guided by the, ancestral knowledge starting to come back to our community. So thank you so much for sharing that. I think that I'm always the glass is half full more than, the half empty. So that silver lining, the inspiration. So I have another question for you. What does a fully restored indigenous food system kind of like ideally look like to you?
Well, ideally, our tribes are really leaning into their sovereign rights of being able to rewrite their own food codes and to create manufacturing kitchens to be able to create the foods. Because the model we're creating with that Meals for Native Institutions here in Minnesota, we're hoping that we can put that right in tribal communities, because that way they can just make their own large format foods for their institutional food needs, to be able to feed a large groups of people in their schools and their hospitals and their community centers and so forth. And that way, if you put one of those manufacturing production kitchens in on a reservation, then you can hire people on the reservation to work that, and it creates the food needs there, and you're intentionally utilizing local and regional food production on top of that, and you're continuing to supply those economies. Because right now, if you go to any rural school on any tribe, like if you go into their schools and their school lunch kitchen and look at what their pantry is, it's just going to be a lot of big box truck foods, of big giant staples coming from those Cisco's and Aramarks and US Foods that are out there. And so we need to shift that. We need tribes to be able to invest in the future of food production and manufacturing, basically, and working on how do we distribute and move those foods around too is kind of a piece to the puzzle. How do we use our land space a little bit better and stop using some of these grandfathered leases out there and start to take back control of a lot of our agricultural spaces and a lot of our fishing rights and water spaces too, and just being able to utilize those, but putting a lot of time and effort into the future of all of that. And how do we create a circular economy by putting it in play with what we're already doing and changing the way we think and eat, because I see a lot of these, again, these rural tribes, like they buy most of their food products from a Cisco or something, from a Walmart or something like that, and we need to get away from pushing all of our food dollars outside of ourselves. And how can we shift into like creating more foods regionally in our own spaces and to be able to keep those food dollars in, but also working with other tribes and buying other products from other communities, because that diversity is great. And we like to have food diversity. And so we want to be able to trade and to be able to move foods around and to work with each other. And so we need unified voices out there, and we need to really kind of take a look nationally of how we can work together as Indigenous communities all over the place, and how can we really connect with each other and create a lot of trade and commerce amongst ourselves also. And so there's a lot of particular ways that we can come up with solutions to challenges out there. And so, but it's just going to take a matter of us actually doing it. It's going to take a matter of getting some tribes to really be aware of what they're doing. And I'm hoping that we can work with some tribes when they're developing some of these casinos and these entertainment spaces, and because some of them are very busy and have large food operations, but again, like they're hiring third parties to create foods that have nothing to do with indigeneity. They might throw a native name on a tribal casino restaurant, but how much indigenous food is actually in that particular space, So we need to we've created a working model here in Minnesota of what an indigenous restaurant can look like. And it's a model that works. It's a model that's won lots of awards, and we have the proof of concept. So it's doable, and we just want to help share with that, so people can reach out to us if they need to, and we can help develop brands and recipes and menus and things like that. But we can also just bring people in and invite people to work in our kitchens or have their chef teams come and work with our chef team and learn from us, as we're kind of doing all this work, because we see a bright future out there for indigenous foods, but we need more people to be a part of it. And we need the tribes to be afraid to have indigenous foods on their menus, and because there's so much opportunity, and we need to think about the power of those food dollars, of where they're going and who we're supporting, so there's a lot of work to do out there.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you have been there doing that work and inspiring these systems. I, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of work in my tribal community around creating the infrastructure for our salmon processing, because it's just not there at a scale where we could start exporting to other tribes, to have portion controlled packages available for senior citizens programs. And I had the really amazing opportunity of visiting the Grand Traverse community's fish processing facility. Love how they built out that facility, but my biggest obstacle in building out a vertical always comes down to the waste. Like, so much what I see is what could potentially be liquid gold for composting, and they're doing it. They decided, we'll get a grant, we'll put some money of our own in, and we'll figure it out. So they have an amazing composting facility to start working on some land nourishment and enrichment. So I agree with you. It really just takes starting small and scaling out wherever possible, because the ritual of practice and not doing something, sets us on a bad path or course way of just feeling really helpless. So what is one daily food ritual that grounds you? We opened with breath. That is really, I think, one of those rituals that helps me kind of get the bubble guts out before I do a show. So ritual, very important to Indigenous communities. Is there any specific food ritual that grounds you?
Oh, it's a tough call, because I'm just on the move. I feel like espresso has been my ritual in the morning. But no, I just like to, you have to take a moment, you have to take a breath, you have to have your moment of Zen before you get into the day, and you have to just clear your mind. And because, there's a lot, and I have a lot on my plate, and I'm pulling a lot of strings right now, and we're managing a lot. We have a lot of growth. We have a lot of employees, and we're getting ready to probably double the size of our staff here in the next month and a half. And so there's just a lot going on. So, I don't know, it's probably not the healthiest just because I grew up in the restaurant industry. And as a chef, you're used to just making it happen no matter what the circumstances are, and dealing with whatever chaos is thrown at you and having to think on your feet constantly. So I think all of those skills that I gained as a chef has really helped me just move really fast in the business world when it comes to organizing these large pieces, and just putting everything into play and just trying to manage all of this, and being able to see this like galaxy of all these tasks in front of me, to just keep everything moving forward. And so, but it's a lot, but I can't do it on my own. So that's why we're just building an amazing team, to be able to work with different skills and just, different focuses and different responsibilities. And it's all about just putting a lot of belief into the people you're working with, and giving them a lot of freedom to be able to make the right calls, and just trying to keep everything moving forward. So it's a huge team effort for all of this work. And so it's just, I think that taking that time to connect with your team on an individual basis, and just making sure that everybody's good, and, just doing health and mental checks with everybody. And, if somebody needs a little extra attention, then just see what you can do to try to keep everybody healthy and moving forward.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. I think that aside from intentional breath work, coffee, espresso, coffee in all forms, one of my favorite plants in this whole wide world, I tell you, is the coffee bean.
And I know it's got a dark colonial history, but we intentionally buy from very specific single source coffee producers at the restaurant, just to make sure they can talk about where this particular bean is coming from, and the community that's growing it, and how supporting them is helping them, and all of these pieces, because everything needs a story behind it and intentionality behind it. So we feel good about the coffee that we bring in and the people that we're supporting, and we're never going to take coffee from natives. So that's just the way it is.
I love that you bring this up because, fair trade, organic, certified, this practice of labeling for ethical reasons. We have our Intertribal Agricultural Council with the trademark and, the opportunities to really align our Indigenous food systems. But how do you think we can move forward to honor the gifts of Mother Earth without over consuming or commodifying them?
Oh, I mean, that's just another massive challenge. And that's why, again, it starts with ourselves. It starts with how do we change our own habits that have normalized in our lifetime of just, maybe not eating the most healthy foods, or, grabbing some of these overproduced snacks that aren't good for us. And we know it, but we can't help it because we love it, And so some of these changes can be hard to change, And so, again, like if we're able to do it, then we can, talk to other people and help them through the same challenge, and just thinking about like, what are we doing? Because if you like go to an IHS or a hospital in general, and there's always going to be a vending machine with just crappy snacks and sweets and oversugared sodas and all that kind of stuff. Like, why are we doing that? Like there should be simple solutions of like, why can't we have healthy vending machines, especially at an IHS, with healthy native foods and snacks available for people to grab, to start to normalize, because eating healthy will help us on the back end of our health issues, And so like we need to get in front of all of that. And so it's just going to take a lot of positive changes, that might not be popular up front, because but people will adjust, because like when I launched the first business venture under the Sioux chef, which was called the Tatanka truck, we had this really beautiful, cool native food truck, but we knew we weren't going to have fry bread on it, and like, what are people going to do when they come to visit this native food truck with no fry bread on it? And there's all this health healthy food instead, but it worked. Like, people still like us after all of these years of not serving a single piece of fry bread.
Yes. Well, I do know that red dye number 40 created a specific taste on my palate when I was a little girl. I was addicted to atomic fireballs. Could not get enough of those darn atomic fireballs. It was insane. So that is one ingredient I think we should probably all avoid, and glad to see things kind of going in the closet there. Also, you had mentioned, kind of going back to the way that things were before. My mom had told me a story that when she was a little girl, she could get apples in a vending machine at her elementary school. I'm like, where are all the apple vending machines in our schools these days, right?
Yeah, and just think about, like, with those schools, like, they usually have a big lawn outside or something. Like, you could just put a bunch of food plants out there, and then you can use that as outdoor education, because you can see berry plants and various trees that you can utilize throughout the seasons. And and you can have apple trees out there if you want to. You can have whatever you want out there, but you can also put native names on those trees out there and all the plants, and have little school gardens for people to play with and learn, because we need more of that kind of outdoor education, because we're not teaching our kids where food comes from. And we need to be able to shift that whole narrative.
Absolutely. So I mentioned that one ingredient we should all avoid. What is one ingredient that you believe everybody should be connecting with?
I mean, again, it really depends on your own region, because we're so diverse. There's so much bioregion out there across North America. So it depends on where you might be at that moment, But again, it's just connecting with what's outside you, like just around your house, So just looking at what trees are growing out there and learning the names of those trees, or what plants are on the ground, and learning which ones are indigenous and which ones were introduced later. But how all these plants can play a role in our lives today, and how most of the plants around us, have some purpose of edibility or medicinal, or something you can do with them. And it's just that reconnection with where we happen to be, I think, is the most important piece. So for me, it's hard to pick a particular one ingredient, because I see this really diverse growing system around myself, like even in my backyard, because right now I have, like, it's springtime, so there's wild gingers popping up. There's fiddleheads in my backyard. There's maple seeds that we're harvesting and utilizing right now, because they're like little edamames, There's like wild sochan in my backyard, and there's all these things that are just in my backyard. And so, like, I just try to utilize what's around us, and talk about that.
So, how do you think people can begin their healing relationships with food if they've been disconnected from the natural whole ingredient world?
I mean, curiosity, I think, is the first step of just wanting to learn more, and that's why we're putting out some of these cookbooks. It's like, my first cookbook was called the Sioux Chef's Indigenous Kitchen, that came out in late 2017, early 2018. And that one just kind of laid out the philosophy, and it's done really well over the years, just because it was a unique look at American foods, and especially from this Indigenous lens. And the second cookbook is massive. It's almost a textbook, because it's taking on all of North America, from the bottom of Mexico to the top of Alaska. And there's so much to talk about in every single region, across the US and Canada and Mexico. And so there's so much regional diversity. So people just need to really want to learn first, and learn about, be very open that, what they've learned, there might be a lot more out there, and that there's more to Indigenous foods than fry bread, and bannock and stuff like that. And we need to, like, really focus on understanding what is out there, and starting to be curious about learning more about plants, or producing, or like processing animals, or using different animals that's not a cow, a pig, or a chicken, since those animals weren't even from North America or a part of our traditional diets at all. And so there's, people need that curiosity to have to want to change, so that's part of where it starts. And it's getting people curious. And I think that's where food comes in with its power, is because people love to see beautiful foods. People love to go to these events where there's Indigenous foods going, and it sparks that curiosity. So the more that we're having some of these kinds of events and conferences, and starting to normalize seeing traditional foods at a lot of our gatherings, at a lot of our powwows, and whatever it might be. So it's not just the same old situation all the time of just what we know is unhealthy, because sure, some of those fast foods and junk foods are fine because people like them to have some walking tacos or whatever, but again, like, let's have some that are really featuring some beautiful foods that really come from ourselves, and with products that aren't coming from Walmart, but products that we're purchasing from or harvesting from our community and from our region, and making that part more normal, so we need more creative chefs out there to inspire that curiosity and that wanting to learn more and start to change ourselves.
I believe that anyone can find great inspiration from either one of your cookbooks. And I think the biggest reason is your integration of storytelling. It's not just picking up recipe and just reading weights and measurements. The stories behind the recipes and even just your introduction into both books is very inspiring. So can you just share a little bit about what that whole process is like? And I'm going to do a cookbook and the intensive level of collaboration that something like that takes.
Yeah, I mean, the first book, I started right out of the gate as soon as I started the Sioux Chef officially. Has a business back in 2014, and I was connected with Beth Dooley, and we were able to sign a book with the University of Minnesota Press right out of the gate. So that started in early 2015. And I was still learning so much back then, but I had this vision of what I wanted to see. And I built that cookbook because I just wanted to use it for education, because I knew we were traveling around a lot, starting to travel around a lot. And I was starting to get asked to talk more and more about Indigenous foods. And I saw the future that there was a lot of opportunity there, but I didn't really know where it was going to take me back then. And I just really wanted to create a volume to be able to share with people. And that's kind of and so that first book was a lot of iPhone photos, and there wasn't a lot of money involved with that one. And we just kind of strung it together. And Beth was an amazing co-author to work with on helping to get that put together. And it's a beautiful book, I'm very proud of that book. And the second one was just so much more intention after all of these learnings over the years, and just really wanting to open up people's eyes to, like, it's not just one Indigenous cuisine out there. There's so much diversity, and starting to explore that diversity, and using this book as kind of a Trojan horse to talk about some really difficult histories here and there, but also bringing in some other Native voices and just really connecting with people all over the place to help tell their stories, because I didn't want to be, mansplaining everybody's Indigenous foods across North America and across Turtle Island, because, I come from a very specific place and I live in a very specific place, but I wanted to help share those voices and share those philosophies and stories. It's a huge undertaking because Turtle Island was massive. Like, that was a huge volume of work to put together, and it came with many, many challenges. And I know it really challenged all of us who worked on it, but we got through the other side, and now we have this really beautiful book that we're very, very proud of.
I love this because you just shared that this is this vulnerable place of stepping outside of your own cultural region or zone, and we're talking about nourishment, and at a very surface level we can all do that, but when we shift the conversation to food as medicine or food as transformation, then we kind of get back into that. I know I can talk about salmon, I can talk about my berries, I can nettles and our hummus and our cows, but outside of my own cultural zone or my own cultural region, I have so much to learn. So I wanted to say thank you so much, first of all, for publishing this book, because your second book sits on my nightstand, and I love to read recipes for things that I may not ever even make, but I
Yeah.
just love. It's almost like poetic. So I know I'm still like kind of just nerding out here, but like I seriously think that people should pick up recipe books just for that purpose, even if they have no intention of actually maybe even making those ingredients, or finding a way that you can take something about that recipe and reconstruct it into something with your own gifts from your table or from your kitchen, your Mother Earth's kitchen in your own backyard.
No, I mean, it's a huge book, and there's so much to talk about. And we put a lot into it, and I've been playing the idea of maybe doing an audiobook, because it's very atypical to have an audiobook of a cookbook. But I think that this one is such a different one that would be great to be able to have that format out there, because there's a lot to talk about, and there's a lot of stories in there, and every recipes are unique, and it wasn't built for to recreate every recipe, because you're not going to find, seal and whale and iguana and javelina at a local Whole Foods, so, but it was really about challenging like how amazing and unique every region is and how much more food is out there than we see on a typical American plate, and that we need to just completely change our mindset and get away from the Eurocentrism of it all and really kind of focus on how do we want to see our Indigenous futures in our foods.
Well, colonization has definitely disrupted our traditional food systems, but the work that your teams and your communities have done, have definitely reclaimed them in leaps and bounds. So thank you so much for all of that work and also for sharing what you do. As you talk about, there's a lot of things that are just still very taboo conversations, and for you to actually, share a little bit about your cannabinoid plant medicine experiences is also very helpful to help deconstruct narratives and shift people's mindsets. Talking about seed, talking about foods as medicines. What are some of the challenges that you see that we still have ahead of us in trying to make this more mainstream, our foods, our medicines, and the work that we do?
There's a lot of challenges. I mean, because just having access to the foods is a huge challenge of how do we create more access out there and start to normalize seeing some of these food access kind of all over the place, to be able to get these foods into our own homes or into our schools or wherever. So that's a big challenge. And then just the food production side of it, because land access is always going to be a major issue for us, because we're living in a post-colonial situation, and, colonialism's never ended. It's still very active in the world today. But I mean, and we're still seeing forms of colonialism happening right now with trying to take over some of these natural land spaces or open up some of our national parks that have been protected for so long to be able to, so people to bring in other like mining and lumber companies that can tear down more, and destroy more spaces for the sake of capitalism. And so land access is a huge issue for us always, because we still live in a world where the United States is 98% of the private land owned is still controlled by European descendants, and so like we need to really understand how we can adjust our land spaces better. But again, I think tribes really need to take on the challenge of really thinking about what are they doing with their land spaces and how can we really start to turn things in the future and to create a long-term plan, because it doesn't have to be short-term return. Like you don't have to just try to make a quick buck off of things. That's not the point of it. It's about how do we really think about the future of our land spaces and think 10, 20, 50 years out, for the next generations, and how can we implement challenges to create more foods and to harvest more foods and to process more foods for a better future, to make it, to really lean into that food sovereignty side of it, of really taking the power of our own food systems back to us and not being over reliant on government food programs like FTPA or commodity foods, but really starting to work on ourselves and really starting to work on production and manufacturing for ourselves when it comes to our own foods.
Yes, we are certainly Indian rich amongst our own landscape and the gifts of Mother Earth just in and of herself. It's been such a wonderful conversation talking about food, medicine, systems, rebuilding and reclaiming systems. And I know that the challenges are great, but the resilience of our communities, I think, is even mightier. And so, as we close out today's program, if you could just share with our listeners, what does healing with food mean to you in, just kind of a nutshell?
Food is everything, because food to me is a language, and it's a language that we all share. So I use food to reach out and connect with people constantly, and we have all of these things where with social medias, you can share beautiful pictures of food to make people curious. I use my platform very specifically to talk about really difficult subjects, and to talk about really difficult challenges that are out there for Indigenous peoples, especially the history that we had to go through just to even be here right now today, and talk about things, how we can make changes for a better future and challenging people, And so I think food really has helped drive this narrative, and it's going to continue to be very powerful, and I want to continue to use food to open up more doors and to get people to be curious and to bring people together and to create that connection, because, I I really believe in just leaning into the humanity of things. Of Indigenous peoples can save the world if we are able to bring a lot of our Indigenous knowledge on a global scale into our food systems, of eating healthier, having healthier growing practices, and more diverse growing practices, and just more sustainable harvesting and all sorts of things, because we have all these massive challenges with climate change and water crisis happening right now, and the mercurialness of governments of, we're shifting from left to right all the time. And we need to find our center of how do we center on humanity, and how do we just really focus on what's most important is how do we keep people happy and healthy and have access to clean foods and clean water.
Yes, I am, again, as I mentioned earlier, very inspired and motivated by the work that you're doing, because I do see that it has to be that regional approach where the hyper localized food systems allow that nourishment to thrive in culture and in community. So thank you again for taking some time out of your day to share with our Gaia Gossip listeners, and for just again inspiring Indian country, Turtle Island in this movement, because it has definitely raised the bar, to be able to have the types of accolades, even if that's not what you're going after. The flowers are following you with these, the James Beard Leadership Award, the Cookbook Award, knowing that there's another one around the corner. So just know that the love of Indian country certainly supports you and the work that you're doing to reclaim Indigenous food systems. And Sean, if you could let our listeners know where they can find you, find your next journey, how they can order your book, and what's next for all of the work that you're doing with your food lab and the grand opening for your next restaurant date. That's another one that I personally want to know.
Yeah, I mean, we have a galaxy of different brands floating around out there. So there's a lot of social media because we have Instagram, like at Owamni, we have natives_org, we have the Sioux Chef, which is my own. So it's the_Sioux_chef, but you can just look me up. You can find most things if you just go to my website, which is just SeanSherman.com under my name. But you can also go directly to our nonprofit website, because our nonprofit oversees everything, including the restaurants. So natives.org, which is natifs.org, has a lot of information. It has links to the store where people can buy a lot of the retail products or connect with us about wholesale products, or link to a lot of our educational videos and all of those types of pieces. And we're really excited because Owamni is officially closed now. We've moved out of our original space, which you were able to visit before. And so it was very bittersweet because we loved that beautiful location, but we're just moving a couple blocks downriver to what's called the Guthrie Theater, which is this big national theater. And it's a really amazing, beautiful, kind of modern looking building on the outside. But we're moving from this little 78-seat restaurant we had on the river to a 204-seat restaurant on the river just a few blocks down. And we've changed the brand because we felt Owamni kind of created its own legacy, and this wasn't going to be the same Owamni. So the new restaurant we're reopening is called Indigena by Owamni, which is just the Spanish word for indigenous. And we're just going to be more of everything. So more choices, bigger space, and it's just going to be bigger and better. And that's our hopes, is just continuing to evolve. So.
Well, congratulations. Definitely look up all of the information that you can find on the work that Sean is accomplishing on behalf of Turtle Island. It has been a wonderful opportunity to have this conversation with celebrity Oglala Sioux chef Sean Sherman. Look forward to more conversations on Gaia Gossip, and thank you all on behalf of Her Many Voices Foundation for such a wonderful program. Thank you so much, Sean.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you again for joining us at Her Many Voices Gaia Gossip. Remember, whatever you do for another, you do for yourself. For more information, head over to hermanyvoices.org to learn more about other programs and get involved. From all of us at Gaia Gossip and Her Many Voices Foundation, thank you, and until next time.